Alla Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese. My name's Rainbow Dave and I am very excited to welcome you to our very first video in a new series that will continue the story of the first age of Middle-earth. So in previous series I talked about the beginning of days and the origins of the elves in Middle-earth, and I've also talked about the story of Fëanor, the greatest elven craftsman ever, and the creator of the three blessed, hallowed, semi-divine Silmarils. Now, if you've seen those videos, they will be helpful in following the events of these videos, but for this video specifically, you won't actually need to know too much of it. And that's because in the previous series of videos, the story focused almost exclusively on the elves of the West. The High Elves, the Liquendi, the elves of the Blessed Realm. The Dark Lord, who the Eldar renamed Morgoth. And pretty much all the major players in that story, at least amongst the elves, were Noldor, i.e. Finwë and his family, most notably Fëanor and his half-brother Fingolfin. And it was only at the very end of that story that the Noldor finally crossed the sea and arrived in Middle-earth. But because Tolkien's sub-creation, his literary works, are so astoundingly rich and full of life, that doesn't of course mean that there was nothing going on in Middle-earth before the Noldor arrived. So in this video I'm going to move away from the story of the Noldor, at least for a little bit, and instead I'll talk all about the other groups of elves who already dwelt in Middle-earth. The Dark Elves, the Liquendi, who never sailed west, who never beheld the light of the trees of Valinor, and who lived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years beneath the starlight in the lands of Beleriand. Now, just before I move on, I do want to take a second just to clarify exactly what I mean by Beleriand, because it's a word that I'm going to use a ton of times over the course of these coming videos, but if you're only familiar with The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, then you may very well never have seen it before. You see, this is a map of Middle-earth that can be found in the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, and it's got all the familiar places from pretty much everywhere that's mentioned in the Third Age. I'm sure you guys have seen it before. But what this map does not include are the lands of Beleriand. And this is because by the time of the Third Age, and I don't want to give too much of a spoiler here, but I'll say this at least, the lands of Beleriand are no longer around. At least not above the water. But if you look at this Middle-earth map, you will see hints of what used to be. Because if you take a look up here in the northwest, you will see the Blue Mountains, the Ered Luin. But if I show you a First Age map, a map of Beleriand, you will see that the same Blue Mountains are now in the very east. So basically everything that you see here is Beleriand, a vast area to the northwest of everything we see in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and with perhaps the sole exception of Khazad-dûm, which I'll talk about when I do my video on the origins of the dwarves, everything else that I'm going to talk about for the pretty foreseeable future, at least until the beginning of the Second Age, will take place here, in Beleriand. Now, there are some really great maps out there from a lot of different Tolkien fans who have tried to stitch the two maps together to illustrate exactly how Beleriand is connected to the rest of Middle-earth. And you'll notice that they're all just a little bit different, and that's because Tolkien himself never actually constructed a map of Middle-earth and Beleriand together. And so all these require a little bit of artistic license. Although I do find that they're a really useful way of visualizing how the continent fits together, so it is worth keeping in your mind. Now, I guess the next question that may be on your mind is how exactly does a vast swathe of continent simply disappear beneath the ocean? It's a pretty cataclysmic story, and it's also the entire story of the First Age. So in this video, I'm going to start back at the beginning, with the first king of Beleriand. His name is Eleuthingol, King Greymantle, the High King of the Cinder, the Grey Elves of Twilight. And also, fun fact, Eleuthingol is the tallest elf ever to live. And Eleuthingol's people are the Liquendi, the Dark Elves, the elves that never sailed west and were never enlightened by the light of Valinor. And whereas the High Elves of the West, the Liquendi, are known for their knowledge and might and skill with metal and jewels, the Cinder of Beleriand are known instead for their singing and their woodcraft. These are elves of starlight. They lived peacefully in Beleriand for thousands of years of nothing but starlit night. However, despite Eleuthingol ruling as the High King of the Cinder and the unopposed Lord of Beleriand, he was not like the rest of his people. Eleuthingol was one of the High Elves. He alone, amongst all the elves of Beleriand, had beheld the light of the West. He was the sole High Elf ruling as king over the land of the Dark Elves. So, how did Eleuthingol acquire this distinction? What made him so unique amongst the elves of Beleriand? Well, Eleuthingol wasn't always known by that name. Way back in the day, he was known by another name, and it's a name I've actually mentioned before on this channel, although it was quite a long while ago. So, if you've seen this episode, then you will remember the great journey that the original elves made from their place of awakening in the uttermost east all the way to the western shores of Beleriand, where many of them travelled across the sea to Valinor. And these original elves were split into 3 factions, which are in turn led by one of 3 ambassadors, who'd already beheld the light of the West, and were now leading their people back to it. The ambassador of the Noldor was Finwë, who went on to become their first High King, and he's a guy that I talked a lot about in previous videos, all about his son, Feanor. But way back when Finwë was first leading the Noldor to the sea, he developed a close friendship with another one of the ambassadors, Elway, the High King of the Teleri. Now, just like Finwë, Elway had also been ennobled by the light of the West, but before he could return there with his people, he was permanently distracted by something in the east. He disappeared. And eventually Finwë and many of Elway's people, who were now led by their new king, Olwë, had to go on across the sea without him, or else they'd miss their chance to journey west and live amongst the Valar. But there were some Teleri who would not abandon their original king. They refused to leave Beleriand, and for a very long while they waited on the shores of Beleriand for their long-lost king Elwë. These wayward Teleri became the ancestors of the Cinder, the mightiest of the Dark Elves. But Elwë was not lost forever. Now, the last time I mentioned him, back in his 4th ever video, I think, the last thing I said about Elwë was that he was drawn deep inside this ancient forest called Nan Elmoth. And he was drawn there by the spell-binding song of nightingales. And inside that forest, Tolkien tells us that an enchantment fell on him, and he stood still. He forgot then utterly all his people and all the purposes of his mind, and following the birds under the shadow of the trees, he passed deep into Nan Elmoth and was lost. But that is not the end of his story, for in Nan Elmoth, Elwë met his future wife, the most powerful queen ever to rule in any part of Middle-earth. Her name is Melian. But unlike Elwë and Finwë and Feanor and Galadriel and almost all the other major characters we've met so far, Melian is not an elf. Melian is a Maya. She is one of the Ainur, one of the angelic beings who was created by Eru Ilúvatar before even the universe was made. She is Tolkien's equivalent of basically an angelic being, and she's of the same order as Sauron. And also, Melian wasn't just any Maya. In fact, Tolkien wrote that among her people there were none more beautiful nor more skilled in enchantment than Melian. And in wisdom, only the Maya who would one day become known as Gandalf could surpass her. Melian taught the nightingales how to sing. She taught the elves how to make lembas. And before meeting Elway, she served no fewer than 3 ladies of the Valar, the greatest of whom, Yavanna, she was said to be akin to. And so, when Elway first laid eyes on Melian, he was immediately filled with love. Which I guess is fair enough, really. We're told that the light of Aman was in her face, and straight away a spell was laid on him. In fact, Tolkien describes this really magical scene where Melian and Elway stand together in silence whilst the stars wheel above them, and the trees of Nan Elmoth grow tall around them. And before either of them speaks a word again, Elway is an entirely new person. In fact, we can calculate that it was 210 years, as we would reckon it, before Elway awoke from his trance, and departed Nan Elmoth and returned to his now Sindarin people. And when this finally happened, Tolkien tells us that his people gathered around him in joy, and they were amazed, for now he appeared as it were a lord of the Maiar. And from that day, Elway was known only as King Elu Thingol, King Greymantle, the Lord of the Cinder and of all Beleriand, the husband of Melian the Maya. So, eventually Elu Thingol did what all kings do. He built himself a kingdom. And if we look again at the map, we'll see that roughly in the very centre there is a great forest, or technically it's 3 different forests, but right in the heart of them, Thingol and Melian ruled the great Sindar kingdom of Doriath. Now, just as somewhere like Gondor refers to an entire country and not just one city, Doriath also refers to the entire woodland kingdom of Elu Thingol. But his capital, the halls from which he rules, are called Menegroth, which means the 1,000 caves. And a very interesting fact about Menegroth, unlike most other elven cities, Menegroth was actually built, at least in part, by dwarves. Now, I know I've not mentioned dwarves yet, and honestly, if I were to go into their whole story right now, it would derail this whole video. But rest assured, in a few weeks, I will release a video fully explaining the origins of the dwarves and how they came to be in Beleriand. For now, though, all you need to know is that there were dwarves and there were elves, and they lived happily together in peace. In fact, it was upon Melian's suggestion that Thingol commissioned the dwarves to help build Menegroth, and they did so in a dwarven style. Menegroth was delved entirely underground, beneath a rocky hill, and it's a very, very cool example of how great things can be when dwarves and elves work together. We often think of the 2 races as being rivals, don't we? And one day they certainly will be, but during the ages of Starlight, this is not the case. And so the dwarves built the King of the Cinder and his angel wife an incredible, hidden, underground city hewn in living stone. And when the tunnels and the caves were delved, the elves decorated their city with their own skill. Tolkien describes fountains of silver and basins of marble and floors of many-coloured stones. Carven figures of beasts and birds there ran upon the walls, all climbed upon the pillars or peered among the branches entwined with many flowers. That was the fairest dwelling of any king that has ever been east of the sea. In fact, Tolkien even mentions these woven tapestries that were created by Melian and her maidens. And these tapestries tell stories of the Valar. They depict the history of Arda, and they even show shadows of things that were yet to be. So yeah, Menegroth is a really cool place. And although we know for sure that Thingol and Melian lived there for the rest of their time in Middle-earth, with just a little bit of speculation, we can also consider some other fan-favourite characters who very probably began their lives in Menegroth as well. You see, we know that Legolas's grandfather, a guy called Orifer, was originally an elf of Doriath, and it's possible that perhaps even Thranduil began his life in Menegroth. And we can say with even more certainty that one of Menegroth's young princes had a familiar face too. You see, through his younger brother, the wonderfully named Elmo, Elu Thingol's grandnephew is in fact none other than Galadriel's future husband, Celeborn. However, although the Cinder are the mightiest and the most powerful of the Dark Elves in Beleriand, they aren't the only elves living there. So, all Dark Elves of Beleriand are descended from that third clan of the Eldar, the Teleri, so they are all technically of Thingol's people. But during these long years of starlight, the Teleri of Beleriand split and sundered into a few more different groups. And my personal favourite of these groups are the Falathrim, the coastal elves. So, the Falathrim are a little bit different from the other Dark Elves, as generally the Elves of Beleriand are not lovers of the sea. In fact, we know that many of the Green Elves, who I'll talk about in just a minute, were actually afraid of the ocean, but not the Falathrim. These guys are sea elves. Back in the day, they were very closely related to the Teleri of Alqualonde, who were of course the victims of the first kinslaying. But unlike the Teleri of Alqualonde, the Falathrim never did actually cross the sea. Instead, they remained on the western shores of Beleriand, and they became Middle-earth's first ever mariners and shipmakers. And the reason that the Falathrim never sailed into the west with the rest of the Teleri is actually a pretty interesting story. And at this story's centre is one of, if not my absolute most favourite character. I don't know, that's a huge statement, but this guy truly is one of the most awesome dudes in the entire Legendarium. His name is Kirdan the Shipwright, and I have so much to say about Kirdan. So Kirdan the Shipwright is the Lord of the Falathrim, and he's also somehow a kinsman of Elu Thingol. Now, we don't know when Kirdan was born, but there are plenty of reasons to believe that he may have been among the first, or perhaps second, generation of elves ever to exist. He is there right at the very beginning of the story, and he's also there right at the very end of it. Kirdan is not only the last named character to appear on the final page of the Silmarillion, but he's also one of the final characters introduced in the final chapter of the final book of The Lord of the Rings. And this means that by the time of The Lord of the Rings, Kirdan is the #1 oldest named elf in all of Middle-earth. He's also the only elf in Middle-earth who's described as having a beard. But that's not the only reason he's so awesome. You see, although Kirdan he's hardly a major character in like the grand scheme of things, he just keeps showing up again and again and again to kick ass throughout every age of Middle-earth. And I'm not going to go into his entire story in this video, but between the very beginning and the very end, Kirdan is present for so many awesome things, and he's just this constant force of goodness and wisdom on the side of the Free Peoples for 10,000 years. Without wanting to spoil anything unduly, he is instrumental in defeating Morgoth at the end of the First Age, and he effectively protects all elven civilization from the Dark Lord. He's the bearer of one of the 3 elven rings in the Second Age. He's one of Gil-galad's top lieutenants during the War of the Last Alliance. He's there when Isildur cuts the ring from Sauron's finger. He helps defeat the Witch King of Angmar in the early Third Age. He looks after a Palantir. He welcomes Gandalf to Middle-earth, and he even gives him his ring. Also, he's part of the White Council that expels the Necromancer from Dol Guldur. And that's not even it. When the Fourth Age begins and the Ring-bearer sets sail into the west, Cirdan is still there as the Lord of the Grey Havens. In fact, he is the one who builds the ships. And as long as there are elves in Middle-earth, Cirdan is there to send them west. He even builds the ship for Samwise Gamgee that reunites him with Frodo in the Undying Lands. And the reason that Cirdan remains in Middle-earth instead of sailing west in the very beginning boils down to 2 reasons. The first is love. We are told that when Elway went missing in Nan Elmoth, Cirdan stayed behind and searched longest and hardest out of all of his kin. In fact, Cirdan waited so long for his lord's return that by the time Eleuthingol finally emerged, Cirdan had missed his opportunity to pass into the west. However, the second reason for Cirdan's long life in Middle-earth has more to do with cosmic destiny. You see, Cirdan is the shipwright, and as such, he could have just built himself and his people a ship, and they could have sailed to Valinor without the help of the Valar, but he didn't. And this is because, as Cirdan stood forlorn on the western shore, he received a message and a vision from the Valar themselves. Cirdan was warned that his ship could not endure the voyage, and that in time he would be called upon to build the finest ship in Middle-earth's history, a ship that would be forever remembered in song. So, Cirdan remained on the shore. He became the Lord of the Falathrim, a close friend of Eleuthingol, and an eternal source of wisdom and foresight. In fact, in the appendices of The Return of the King, Tolkien tells us that Cirdan saw further and deeper than any other in Middle-earth. Now, I know this is all a little bit of a tangent, but I just really, I really like Cirdan. Anyway, the final group of Dark Elves that I need to talk about are the Green Elves, or the Liquendi, who live along the banks of the 7 rivers of Osiriand. Now, there's not really a huge amount to say about the Liquendi, except that they're about as close to traditional Wood Elves as we see in the Silmarillion. They don't have access to the same wisdom or skill as their mightier counterparts, and the Liquendi seem to be more into singing and chilling out under trees than they are into creating anything or really changing the world at all. Now, the king of the Liquendi is a guy called Denethor, son of Lenwë, and he's the one who led his people over the mountains and into Eleuthingol's realm, into Beleriand. Now, obviously, the name Denethor is probably one you're already very familiar with from The Lord of the Rings, and I guess it goes without saying that this Denethor is not that Denethor. Not only is this one an elf, but he's also alive about 8,000 years before that Denethor will be born. However, it is a good example of how people in the Third Age perceived those heroes of the First Age as these kind of mythological figures that parents would name their children after. Anyway, although the Dark Elves of Beleriand lived for thousands of years in peace and prosperity beneath the stars, this series isn't going to go anywhere unless something real bad happens real soon. And as it goes 3,000 years after Eleuthingol married Melian the Maya, an almighty calamity abruptly arrived in Middle-earth. Because, of course, if you have watched those previous videos about Feanor and the Silmarils, then you will know that it's only a matter of time before Morgoth returns to Middle-earth. And when he does, he doesn't come back alone. So in this video, I talked about Morgoth and Ungolliant and how they fled east from Valinor and arrived on the frozen shore of Middle-earth. And we saw how Ungolliant took advantage of Morgoth's weakness and tried to seize the Silmarils from him. Now, this did of course resolve itself when a host of Balrogs came to their master's aid and they chased Ungolliant away after what was probably one of the most hardcore battles ever. But overnight, and I say that both figuratively and literally because Middle-earth has no day at this point, the peaceful lives of Beleriand's dark elves are turned completely upside down. Anyway, when Ungolliant fled, she fled south, over the mountains of terror and into Nandungortheb, the valley of dreadful death. And Ungolliant polluted this place with her offspring, of whom the most famous is of course her last surviving daughter, Shelob. And the reason this is relevant is that Nandungortheb is directly to the north of Thingol's kingdom of Doriath. But Ungolliant never did enter Doriath. In fact, no creature of darkness did. We're told that when Ungolliant came, a terror of darkness was about her, but by the power of Melian, she was stayed. So, let that sink in. Ungolliant, the same Ungolliant who took down the two trees of Valinor, who caught Tulkas, the strongest of all the Valar, in a black net of night. Ungolliant, who strangled Morgoth himself and survived a tempest of fire from a host of Balrogs. She was held at bay by the power of Melian, the most beautiful, the most skilled, at least in songs of enchantment, and the second wisest of all the Maiar. However, back to giant spiders, they aren't the only new threat that the Grey Elves now had to deal with. Once Morgoth returned to his fortress of Angband and discovered the army that his henchman Sauron had kindly built for him, he saw an opportunity to conquer the lightly defended Beleriand and basically to claim the whole realm as his own. And thus began the first Battle of Beleriand. Now, I'm afraid I don't have time to go into a huge amount of detail about this battle, and to be honest, Tolkien didn't tell us a great deal about the actual fighting, but we do know that Morgoth unleashed a few different orc hosts from his northern fortress of Angband, and he sent them to plunder far and wide. One of these orc hosts followed the eastern rivers Kellon and Gelion, and they moved south towards Osiriand, which is the land of the Liquendi under their king Denethor. A second host plundered towards the western coast, and they attacked the Falathrim of Kirdan. And between east and west, a middle host entered the forests of Thingol and threatened Menegroth itself. So, Thingol was basically cut off from Kirdan and his allies in the west, and there were orcs cutting off King Denethor too. But the Cinder of Thingol were far from defenseless. You see, about 1600 years before this battle, at least 1600 years as we would reckon it, evil creatures came even to Beleriand, over passes in the mountains or up from the south through the dark forests. Wolves there were, or creatures that walked in wolf shapes, and other fell beings of shadow. And among them were the orcs, who afterwards wrought ruin in Beleriand. And we're also told that the elves had no idea what these orcs were, but they feared they may be native Avari elves who had become evil and savage in the wild. And this is especially sad because they aren't entirely wrong. Anyway, what this means is that the elves had time to prepare for this first battle of Beleriand, and when it came, they had plenty of weapons. And I have to give major props to the dwarves here, because they are the ones who forge all these weapons and armor for the elves. We are told that in the tempering of steel alone of all crafts, the dwarves were never outmatched, even by the Noldor. And so, Thingol's warriors were equipped with axes, and with spears, and with swords, and tall helms, and long coats of bright mail. And they were fashioned by the dwarves in such a way that they would never rust, and would shine forever. And so, in the first battle between the Cinder of Menegroth and the orcs of Angband, the orcs are utterly defeated, and the few that fled Eleuthingol's might and hurried back up north were waylaid and taken out in a great slaughter by Thingol's dwarven allies. However, sadly, not everyone fared so well. Unlike the Cinder of Menegroth, the Liquendi of Osiriand are light-armed, and no match for the orcs who were shod with iron and iron-shielded and bore great weapons with broad blades. They put up a good fight, but they were eventually cut off from Eleuthingol's warriors and surrounded on this hill called Amon-Ereb. And there, King Denethor was slain by the orcs, and we're told that his nearest kin died about him. And this is a big deal, because apparently there's no one left to continue Denethor's royal line, as we are explicitly told that the Liquendi took no king again. And after this battle, some of the surviving Liquendi returned to Osiriand, and their tidings filled the remnant of their people with great fear. However, King Denethor did not go long unavenged. Eventually, Thingol and his army arrived at Amon-Ereb, where they bitterly killed the orcs surrounding the hill and slew them in heaps. And so, eventually, the first battle of Beleriand ended in victory for the elves and dwarves of Middle-earth, and when the fighting was done, Thingol returned to his wife in the halls of Menegroth. But upon his return, he learned that the westernmost host of orcs, the orcs who'd attacked the coastal lands of Kirdan's people, had been victorious, and they now wandered freely in the west. The only place that was safe from the orcs was behind Kirdan's walled havens at the rim of the sea. And so the Falathrim did survive, but Thingol was unable to send them any aid. Instead, he decided to withdraw his people into Menegroth and the surrounding forests, and he declared that never again would they openly do battle with Morgoth, preferring secrecy over warfare. And to achieve this, Melian used her Maya powers to create a huge magical boundary, a big circular barrier, if you will, that's known forever after as the Girdle of Melan. Everything inside this girdle is called the Kingdom of Doriath, the guarded kingdom of Eleuthingol. Now, this Girdle of Melan is very important because no one can pass through this barrier. No one can enter the Woodland Kingdom without Thingol or Melian's permission. We are told that the lands right on the border of the girdle were wrapped in mists and enchantment, and any uninvited traveller that strayed too far would be enmeshed in the mazes of the Queen, and was forced to wander lost until all their food was spent. It's then implied that they'd die. However, there is one very interesting exception that I'm not going to spoil right now, but what I will say is that even when Melian cast the girdle for the first time at this moment, she knew that one day someone would come to Doriath with greater power than her own, and he would pass through the girdle and survive its effects. Which is some really awesome foreshadowing, but it is foreshadowing for something that won't happen for hundreds of years yet, so I'll save that for another video. But just before I finish this video, there's one more thing that I want to quickly talk about. Because if we jump back for a minute to the Falathrim in their havens by the coast, something crazy awesome happens. Because Kirdan's people are not actually besieged by the orcs for that long. Well, I mean, relative to the immortal lifespans of the elves stuck behind those walls. And the reason for that is that one day, the orcs just kind of leave. They run off up north, and from the perspective of the Falathrim, it looks like it's over. Something far off in the north has drawn the orcs away. And that something is Feanor and the Noldor. Because not long after Morgoth returned to Middle-earth with the Silmarils, the princes of the Noldor arrived in Middle-earth to get even. And the first group of Noldor to arrive in Middle-earth were the radical group of elves who followed Prince Feanor and his now 6 sons. And one of the first things these elves did in Middle-earth was to fight the first battle in the War of the Jewels, the Dagor Nwyn Gileath, the battle beneath the stars. And so, when Kirdan and the rest of the Dark Elves looked out at their war-torn lands, and they saw that the orcs had departed, they got their first clue that something game-changing had just arrived in Middle-earth. Of course, at this point, they didn't know it was a whole bunch of angry Noldor, but I think it's clear from this moment that things will never be the same again. Dark Elves are no longer the only elves in Beleriand. And I'm afraid that is where I'm going to have to end this video, because we've now totally caught up with the previous videos all about Feanor and the Noldor and the Silmarils. But don't worry, because next time we're going to pick right back up with Fingolfin and the sons of Feanor and all the drama that's brewing towards civil war between those guys. Except now the Noldor are away from their home turf, and now they have a powerful Sindarin king to deal with. As well as, the actual Dark Lord. So make sure you stay tuned for the next video, because now that the stories come to Middle-earth, things are only going to get crazier and more intense. So don't miss a thing. More videos coming soon. Until then, however, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Navaya Melanine.